a little bit about myself and my organization. So my name is Dan Wicklum. I'm the CEO of something called the Transition Accelerator. So we're a new organization that was launched about 3 years ago, purposefully to try and come up with new models to accelerate society, Canadian society, to a net zero emissions. But we wanted to do that using essentially the latest in transition theory. We started by going to experts in transition in Canada, and we asked them, if you were going to design a transition of the magnitude of the one that we need to go through in Canada to get to net zero emissions by 2050, would you design the transition the way that we are going through it? What it look like the way we're going through it? And they actually chuckled and they said, not at all. We're sort of making every mistake in the book. And our approach to transition has developed over basically organically over the course of 30 years since the UNFCCC was signed in 92. So we asked them, they can give us some specific examples, like how would you do it differently? And one of the examples that I use, we have a whole foundational document on this. It's on the Transition Accelerator website. But one of the examples I use is that they said, look, it's extremely difficult to get people to change from a known situation to an unknown situation. We're just evolutionarily wired not to put ourselves into an unknown situation. And yet that's exactly what we're doing with this transition. We're in a known situation now, but it's not great. We have this emissions reduction wicked problem. And yet we're asking every individual, every government, every private sector company to go through these massive changes to drive the society to net zero. But I live and breathe this every day, and I don't know what waking up in the morning and living my life in a net zero world looks like. So we're actually asking people to work against their evolutionary biology and work towards an unknown situation. So what at the Accelerator we do, we have a 4-step methodology where we actually help organizations define the future. So instead of just understanding that net zero is sort of a generic goal, for certain areas, and we call them hubs, we work with all relevant stakeholders to actually define the future. What could a net zero energy system, a net zero transportation system, a net zero building system, what could that system look like? And we're actually capitalizing on change theory to demystify the future. And then we help build pathways to those futures. I'm not going to go into details. We've done this in several places across the country. Our most developed one is called the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub, which has quite a developed communication strategy, website, and so on. So you can get some information there. But I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to show you one slide that I think hopefully brings this together. So what we're proposing is a Hamilton Region decarbonization hub. And a hub is not a legal structure. It's essentially a series of analysis and a series of facilitated teams that work together inside of a management framework to define what a future could look like, and then to build pathways to that future. I said I had 2 roles. That's one role. Then my second role is I'm the co-chair of something called the Net Zero Advisory Body, which advises the Government of Canada via the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Prime Minister on interim reduction targets on the way to 2050, and also the most likely pathways to 2050. And NZAB has adopted this idea that we must evolve our decarbonization strategies from sector-specific plans. And when you think about it, that's what we've been doing for 30 years. We have emissions reductions plan for oil and gas. We have emissions reduction plan for transportation and for buildings and for agriculture and for industry. But the reality is that those sector-specific plans was probably a good way to approach things when all we had to do was reduce emissions. Because if all you have to do is reduce emissions, your underlying systems don't have to change. All you have to do is make the systems more efficient. But now we're in an emissions elimination paradigm. Net zero changes everything. And we feel strongly that you can't just keep the exact same systems and make them more efficient and all of a sudden feel that functional net zero emission systems like energy and transportation and buildings are going to magically appear in 2050. We think we have to retool the systems. and in a way where those systems now interact and synergies are realized. So the concept of a hub is evolving from sector-specific emission reduction plans to regional decarbonization. They're systems-based. They're based on new value chains. We feel very strongly that these types of decarbonization plans need to be driven by the market. They need to be driven by the users, so they need to be driven by industry, where can actually be synergies made. So very generically, a Hamilton region decarbonization hub could look something like this. The genesis of all of this decarbonization hub work came from the steel sector approaching the Transition Accelerator and asking us to apply the model to this area. So we're quite well developed, working with the steel companies to understand their decarbonization needs. But the idea is that we wouldn't just try to decarbonize the steel sector. We would use the steel sector, what we're calling an anchor tenant, because they are not just in terms of the energetics, but culturally, they're one of the major driving forces in the Hamilton region. So Hamilton sort of goes as steel goes. So we would look for the ways where how we could decarbonize steel in ways that would also open up decarbonization options for buildings. It's exactly what we're talking about this meeting, but also open up decarbonization options for transportation or for other industry. So I'd say we're at the germ stage of launching this hub. The steel sector has asked us to start with essentially them and using really a customer focused rather than a technology provider focused. That's one of the organizing principles for this emerging hub. And we're starting to work now into the full value chain of the steel sector, back into the transportation companies, raw materials coming into their plants, and then product leaving. So we have, I think, very strong support from the government of Canada. We have extremely strong support from the City of Hamilton. We're going in front of the City of Hamilton Council quite quickly for a resolution. And we have very strong support from the province of Ontario. We've got four of the key ministries engaged, and they've designated one lead deputy minister to be the single point of contact on behalf of the government of Ontario. I think there's lots of people and organizations that would like to be involved in the hub, and my response back to people is fantastic and absolutely, but in good time. One of the concepts of the hub is to organize interests inside of a framework that's quite well thought out, so that we can develop a work plan and implement it extremely deliberately. There's just too many moving parts, too many competing interests, that if everyone is at the table in the same way at the same time, this collapses under its own weight. So we are starting with the client. We're starting with the governments to frame out what the hub could look like, drawing on experience across the country. But one thing I will say is, if the hub is successful in being launched the way the steel companies wish it to, there will be a place for essentially every entity, whether it's a community organization, whether it's a technology provider, whether it's a company. There will be a place for every entity to plug in and be part of the hub in an appropriate way. So some of the conversation I heard earlier here was around this notion of like, how do you start? How do you start these conversations? Like, this is exactly what these types of hubs are launched, is to actually bring interests that usually do not interact together, but may have common values and shared objectives. It's a place for them to come together and advance agendas.